So for today's class, we're going to be learning about period 3 in United States history. Um, yeah, so since last week we worked on period 1 and 2. So let's go into the next slide. So this unit or this period will be mainly focusing on severing ties with Great Britain. So it's going to last approximately from 1754 to 1783. So we're going to be discussing the causes and effects of the American Revolution and just certain things that led up to the founding of our country. So first, for context, because of period 2, we talked a lot about how North America was not only English colonies, but there were also French settlement and there's also Spanish settlement. So actually right almost near where the English colonies or English colonists were settled, there were French settlement. So because of disputes over certain materials, I wrote here fur trading and resources, and just trading and conflict with Native Americans and the colonists and the French and Indian War happened. So it was mainly a struggle for control of the upper Ohio River Valley. So the upper Ohio River Valley consisted a lot of resources, and I talked about before, it was a really good piece of land where you could trade with Native Americans and make a lot of profit. So the French and Indian War, many people confuse it. It was actually not just French versus many Native Americans. It was actually between the French and some Native American tribes versus Britain and some of the North English, the northern colonies. So I would say like the English colonies plus some Native Americans. So it's again French with some Native Americans versus Britain and in the English colonies and some Native American tribes. So Britain won the French and Indian War. They passed the Treaty of Paris in 1673, which ended much of French rule in America. It limited much of their land or the land they had before because of the war. And this also meant that since Britain was in the war for this long period of time, they were in debt because they had to lose a lot of supplies, weapons. So this left Britain in debt, and French lost much of the land. But for the colonists, they felt some sort of, I would say, like empowerment and unification because in a way that they finally felt like they were part of a bigger country. They fought for Britain, right? So they felt like they were part of, or they were like more unified in like their cause, and they felt that they were actually part of Britain and they were actually doing something for the country. And so within this period of the French and Indian War, there was also something called the Albany Plan of Union, which was promoted by Ben Franklin. And the Albany Plan of Union basically called for a formation of, I put this in bold, Grand Council of Elected Delegates, because during this time we talked about before how like the land wasn't really like separated explicitly, like there was no fence or there's no like gate. It was kind of like this piece. It was really kind of like unmarked. It was kind of this piece was where the English colonies were, and this where French settlement was. So, and some of it between was like Native American land. So Ben Franklin wanted this elected delegates to oversee this defense against both French people and also Native Americans. So on your left, you see his first, this kind of the first political cartoon. It was like, and you see it's a snake and it being chopped up, and each part of the snake represents a what was a colony. So we have New York, New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and it was this cartoon basically meant that if you don't join or you don't support this elected delegate, you're going to be chopped up. And then the French and Native American land, Americans would take over their land. But the bad part is the plan failed because Britain rejected it. They said that there was like a couple of reasons why. It was like, one, it kind of gave a lot of power to many of the colonists, and two, it was just too complex of a plan. Like, they didn't really want to worry about this idea of like having a grand council in America and then them having to feed criticism. It was just too complex for them. And some of the colonists, or many of the colonies, also didn't want to give up their individual autonomy, because when you're electing a grand council, it means that you have to follow whatever the grand council wanted you to say during wanted you to do during certain situations. So they just wanted like to keep their individual autonomy. They wanted to be able to decide for themselves what to do during certain situations, about whether there was like a French attack or a Native American attack. So as we mentioned before, Britain at the end of the French and Indian War was in debt. So this meant that they needed some source of income, or they needed to repay this debt to certain, I guess, just people or individuals who supported the French and Indian War. So the Stamp Act crisis happened around 1765 to 1776. Basically, the Stamp Act, which was to raise revenue for troops in America. In addition to repaying debt, Britain also had to have troops in the colonies to protect the colonists, right? Because even though they weren't physically attached, Britain was still kind of like the mother country for much of the colonies. So because of the Stamp Act crisis, the colonists really reacted negatively, much different from what Parliament thought they would react. So many colonists insisted that only provincial assemblies, which meant that local assemblies in the colonies, could have the power to raise taxes. And they didn't like the idea of virtual representation. So what virtual representation was that since the colonies and the colonists were like much farther away from the actual land where Parliament was, which basically is like group of elected officials, they had this thing called virtual representation, where Britain said, oh yeah, the colonists, their criticisms, with their feedback, it will be voiced out to much of Parliament. They didn't like that. They wanted something that they wanted their own local people, or their own elected officials who they elected, to actually make up rules, or to actually raise taxes, or do something, or do something for like the colonists, over the colonies. So the most important kind of saying out of this Stamp Act crisis would probably have to be called "No taxation without representation." Basically, it's self-explanatory. It says that we need to be represented in order to be taxed, and virtual representation isn't enough. We have to physically be there. We have to have our own local guides, or not guides, local like elected officials. And so because of all this anger, on October 1765 in New York City, they had the Stamp Act crisis. And this is the first meeting since the Albany Congress, where we talked about the Albany Plan of Union, where that was first drafted. And what the Stamp Act Congress was officials from each colony, they came to New York, and they decided that they would boycott British goods. And they drafted a petition to Parliament saying that they don't like what's going on and they want an alternative. So Parliament responded. As I said before, Parliament didn't know that this would be that this would have like a negative reaction, or like the colonists would be angry. So they didn't really know what to do. So what they did was actually inflict more anger upon the colonists. They said, no, virtual representation is good, and we need it. And they just justified virtual representation. They emphasized virtual representation. But the boycott was actually really, really successful, as it decreased British exports by 15%. So because of this, they said they rescinded the Stamp Act crisis, and they passed a declaratory act, which meant they reassured their authority over the colonies. Basically, some of the things they did was it was kind of like almost like a little bit like they placed a little restrictions upon the colonists, saying that made certain rules that you can't really boycott goods. They made like restrictions, but obviously this was not enforced at all by the colonists, and it was really hard to enforce because no one was physically there, or like and it was really hard to like check up on a country that's like miles away, or colonies were miles away from where you were. So because of this, Britain was still accumulating debt. There was still a lot of things going on, especially since they were still deploying troops in the colonies, right? So you want to take into consideration how the colonies were still growing at this time. It was like an increasing population. So Britain had to deploy more troops to protect these colonies against French invasion, Native American invasion. So from 1776 to 1770, there was the Townshend Crisis. And there was actually a new elected official in Parliament, and he passed the Townshend Act, which was a tax on the daily goods, so around paint, paper, tea, and it brought up a lot of disputes over taxation. Like the colonists were angry again, and they again boycotted the goods. Massachusetts and Boston were actually one of the, I guess, leading colonies to boycott goods and to protest. And the most kind of famous event that happened during this period of time. Oh, I meant to say 1766 and 1770. Oh, I will fix it later. So one of the things that happened the most during this time was the Boston Massacre. Is there anyone who would like to participate to explain what the Boston Massacre was, or what they learned about the Boston Massacre? I don't have your names, but the girl who's raising her hand. Okay. Evelyn? Evelyn? You can respond.
So I know that basically there were protesters, and then the British soldiers, they were supposed to be guarding this place, but they actually attacked the townspeople, and some of them were put on trial. Also, there's another You Choose book called The Boston Massacre.
Yeah, if you want to recommend it, you can tell us this later after class. Thank you for participating, Evelyn. Dana or Dana? Let me... Dana?
The Boston Massacre started when some people who didn't like the soldiers called them redbacks. So they wanted to hurt them, but then someone shouted, "Don't shoot!" But someone heard shoot, so they started shooting the colonists, and then 5 people died.
Yeah. So so the Boston Massacre happened while there wasn't a numerous number of deaths, or much less than what would you consider like a huge conflict, such as the French and Indian War. An important figure named Paul Revere, he depicted the Boston Massacre as something that is very inhumane, and he depicted British soldiers as very inhumane, uncivilized, and they were killing innocent civilians, despite many of the colonists were actually provoking some of the British soldiers before this massacre happened. So this is on your left, you see a picture of what was posted in much of the, I guess, newspapers, or much of the media they had then. And this really riled the colonists up, and they felt really, really angry that like British soldiers were doing some, especially since they were there to help like protect them in the first place. So because of this happened, and because many colonists were angry and they continued boycotting, continued protesting, Parliament repealed the Townshend duties, except for one of them, which was the tax on tea. And next. So because there was still a tax on tea, in December 1773, Boston Patriots actually dressed as Mohawk Indians and they threw tea in the harbor. And this is obviously what's known as the Boston Tea Party. So Britain was really, really upset, especially since they'd lost numerous amounts of tea and their ship was basically destroyed. So they wanted to punish Boston for the destruction of private property. So they passed the Intolerable Acts, which closed the port of Boston and allowed the army to quarter troops. So what it means to quarter troops is basically soldiers can just, show up on the house of certain Boston colonists and say, we need a shelter, and the Boston colonists had to let them in the house. And this oftentimes increased this kind of hate or this kind of anger towards not only the troops but also Britain themselves, because the Intolerable Acts would also be considered a turning point, because it was acts that explicitly show that Britain was trying to restrict certain freedoms from the colonists, and it was strictly towards Boston. So it showed, Britain passing these laws because they didn't like the colonists and they were against the colonists and they didn't like them expressing their freedom or good freedom, or like a regulation of like their own regulations on the economy. So because of the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress was actually, I guess, the First Continental Congress happened in September 1774, where again we see the same theme of boycotting British goods, and the leaders of the Continental Congress urged colonies to organize militia. So we see here around 1773, 1774, the American colonists were already trying to, they weren't on the verge of a revolution yet. They weren't on the verge of a revolution yet, but they were preparing for like some sort of conflict with Britain. Evelyn, you have your hand up. Do you want to add something?
It was raised from before.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Does anyone have any comments on the Boston Tea Party or this slide? Sophie, you have your hand raised.
What does militia mean?
Oh, so a militia is basically like what you would say like soldiers. Okay. So it's an organized group of soldiers. Yep. So they just started organizing weapons and organizing soldiers. I don't know your name, but it's Y, and it's a couple of A's. You have a question?
I feel like we keep portraying the British as Americans, not the British as Americans, like as Americans, we portray the British more as these evil people, but they aren't really evil. They're just not trying to go bankrupt. Think as you were actually a country and you were in so much debt. Would it taxing your colonies be the logical thing to do? Even though right now all we think about is freedom, because we're on the side that is oppressed and not actually on the other side. So we don't really know if they were really the big baddies that we described them as.
That is very true. I would kind of add on to that like, obviously history is always biased and it's always written in a way where, it will support one side over the other. But much of the things that happened pre-American Revolution, many would consider that, I guess Britain restricting certain freedoms is bad. And many of the colonists during this time did feel like a lot of anger towards Britain, because especially since when we talked about period 2, we talked about this idea of like salutary neglect, and how, even though much of the European colonies followed a mercantilist system, they kind of, or Britain didn't really enforce these regulations on the economy for many of the colonies. So they had some form of leeway, and all of a sudden they like bombarded with these acts, even after fighting a war for Britain. So that's like a good thing to think about as well. So Intolerable Acts. So all these 3 periods of acts soon would culminate in a revolution, obviously the American Revolution. So why revolution? So we talked about the 3 periods of acts and the 3 like events that happened during this time. We also talked briefly about the Quartering Act, which was basically soldiers could again pull up to your house and they could demand for food, supplies, shelter, and you had to say yes. Another reason for revolution was also the Proclamation of 1783. The Proclamation of 1783, which was basically Britain limiting the amount of land that many colonists had. So although there were the 13 colonies and then they established around the East Coast, many actually wanted to expand further out west. But the Proclamation of 1783, Britain basically said that you can't, and many colonists were really upset because they kept the land for Native American tribes. Then this idea of republicanism also kind of like arise from the from 3 period of acts and like the many acts that Britain enforced. So republicanism is basically the belief that the government should be based on the consent of the governed. It's an emphasis on a small, limited government responsible to the people. So we talked about before in period 2 how there was already establishments of representatives or like small communal elected officials and delegates. So this idea of like republicanism finally like reached its peak during this time because they felt that Britain was being very tyrannical, and they wanted their own kind of small, limited government. And we also have a book published by Thomas Paine called Common Sense, and this book was really key in motivating colonists to actually support the revolution. It persuaded revolution, and it also said that King George III was a big brute. Said he was very tyrannical, he was crazy, he didn't have to do this, he's just exercising, powers that he shouldn't have, or that like he didn't need to exercise these certain powers. And in Thomas Paine's book, it also said that there's no compromise that the colonies could make with Britain, because Thomas Paine was very set on creating something or separating the colonies from Britain himself. And on the right, it's a little short cover. So we also have the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. That's actually tomorrow is obviously Independence Day, it's July 4th, so I think this is very interesting to bring up. So basically, Declaration of Independence created a new American identity. So we talked about how before what was once a dispute over taxes, that we talked about the Stamp Act crisis, how colonists were really upset over taxes. All these culminations of 3 periods, and then we have republicanism, and we have Thomas Paine. Americans, or I wouldn't call Americans it, but the colonists really now felt that it was time to not fight over these taxes, but actually fight for freedom of rights and freedom of individual rights, and just the rights of these colonies, because they deserved not to be taxed without representation. They deserved not to have these quartering acts, and they deserved to also move west whenever they can. Actually, that idea is actually going to be really important in our later topics. So we talked about, the Declaration of Independence exemplified republicanism, this idea that all men are created equal, and they're the universal principles of, life, and how we should elect our officials into government so they can represent us and they could, really understand our demands, understand our needs. So we also talked about the Enlightenment in period 2. So those principles from John Locke actually cross over here. We have Enlightenment principles throughout the Declaration of Independence. The idea that all men are created equal is kind of quoted by John Locke, an idea that, the state's ability or your government is meant to protect your freedoms, meant to understand your demands. But the thing about the Declaration of Independence, what Thomas Jefferson didn't add is the idea of the abolition of slave trade. So obviously, the slave trade and having slaves contradicted with these Enlightenment principles and these principles of republicanism. But he didn't want to add that the slave trade was banned because he didn't want to abolish slave trade because he wanted the colonies that depended on, slavery. So to actually join in for the fight for the revolution. So we talked about how, Virginia depended on slaves, and much of the southern countries where, there's a lot of tobacco and there's a lot of indigo really needed, a demand for labor and really had a high increased demand for labor. So he didn't want to add that in the Declaration of Independence. So that's something to note. So the American Revolution happened. Right after, certain events. And then, so Britain obviously lost and America was, their own country. So the question is, why did Britain lose? So many historians have said that the British commanders really underestimated American soldiers, or I guess you can call them American soldiers. They felt that they were just farmers, like they were just drunk farmers, some poor merchants that were fighting. But many American soldiers were actually really unified or really united over Republican ideals and this idea to build a new country or build a new form of government for themselves. And also George Washington was resilient plus resourceful. Something to add, George Washington, before he became general of the American Army, or became general for the American Revolution, he actually gained experience through fighting for the French and Indian War. So we have George Washington, who's resilient, who's resourceful, who listens to his, soldiers, and he was also, a really good leader. So he was really good to lead many of the troops who were untrained. Yes. Again, why AAAAA? You can speak. You have a question?
I feel like the things on this list are not the entire story, because
Right.
if you so I feel like it's like this all over America. Like if you go and find the source on the web or anywhere here in America, you'll find you'll find more of how good our soldiers were against how bad their soldiers were, even though it isn't their soldiers were bad or their government was divided. There was a reason why the revolution started anyways, and that was because they were short on money. And you can't really fight a war without money. So there's more than just everyone was confused and the Americans were not confused.
Right, of course. Yeah, there are many factors, and these are just some of the factors that I thought was really important. But yeah, I guess money was an issue, especially in death. But I think another big important part is aid from France, and actually what isn't really talked about, but aid from Prussia. They provided lots of weapons, they provided generals, they provided commanders that really aided in training and drilling, American troops. the most important story, or the most, I guess many people say like the most important part of American Revolution or event, was the Valley, was the kind of like the Christmas, or like the winter at Valley Forge, where George Washington and Wilhelm Baron von Steuben actually trained the American troops to like trained and drilled these American troops to actually like how to use a bayonet, or how to have counterattacks, or like positions they can go through, or like I guess a lot of other things. So I guess the idea that like French and Prussian aid was really, really helpful as well. And then we also, obviously America won, and in 1783 the Treaty of Paris was passed, and basically gave American independence from the Mississippi River to the Great Lakes and part of Spanish Florida. So I guess another thing to consider is that while, there were a lot of colonists that supported the revolution, 15 to 20% of the colonists living there were actually loyalists, meant that they sided with Britain, and then they sided with Britain. So it was like a big number that sided with Britain. But although like, yes, they sided with Britain, they also faced numerous sources or numerous forms of violence, because many American colonists were, very angry with these loyalists, and they felt that they shouldn't side with Britain. So the most, I guess, famous kind of attack on these loyalists were the tar and feathering, where colonists would pour tar on loyalists. Colonists would pour tar on certain loyalists, and then they would feather them, and then it would be considered like an outcast, or everyone would know that they support the British Parliament, and they support Great Britain in their, I guess, many would consider like the conquest of the colonists. So after the American Revolution, many loyalists actually migrated out of the colonies, fearing such violences, and because much of the land was confiscated by the government, or what the colonies had. So this is a very famous picture. We have of Washington crossing the Delaware by Emmanuel Lutz. That's how you pronounce it in American, but I know it's German, so like it's obviously a different pronunciation, but it's a very famous painting showing, Washington being the leader that he is, bringing these troops to, I guess, victory, or a lighter place, or freedom. So, the Articles of Confederation, this is very interesting actually. The Articles of Confederation were actually drafted before America, or before the colonists won the American Revolution. And basically they wanted to, this kind of almost like a system of government, or these like laws, or like ways or rules or guidelines of how like the government should be run. And it served as a temporary, as America was a new nation. So the Articles of Confederation evoked a lot of, the liberty and equality ideals that we mentioned before. And we have to consider that America, right after the Revolution, was a totally, I guess, their form of government was totally new, as in, many of the European countries were still, ruled by a monarchy, or by a one single ruler, or people with subjects. So it was the first kind of like draft of this like new form of like democratic republican government. But obviously, since it was the first kind of like first draft, it was very flawed. As in, it was only a unicameral legislature, which meant that there was only, while we have the three branches of government now, but there's only one branch, and Congress had most of the power. And there was no executive or judicial branch. But even though Congress had most of the power, it had no power to levy taxes or to regulate interstate commerce, which meant that, they didn't really have control over the separate colonies, and it was very hard to control or enforce the Articles of Confederation for these separate different colonies. But it did receive some achievements. As I said again, the Articles of Confederation were written before before the American Revolution ended. So this meant that under the Articles of Confederation, America won the war, and they negotiated the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. And there was also the establishment of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which banned slavery from the Northwest Territory, where there wasn't really a need for slavery, since much of the economy we talked about before was based from the hardwood trees and the wood and timber for building ships. There was not, or other methods other than plants or agriculture. Yes, Sophie, you have a question?
Can you explain the picture on the right?
Yeah.
I don't get it
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah, so basically the picture on the right is to show you how kind of unstable the Articles of Confederation was. We see like the waves kind of like almost, rocking the ship, almost like taking over the ship, right? So all these things on the water, all these words show the flaws of the Articles of Confederation. So we have no power to enforce treaties, no power to enforce laws, no power to raid an army, no power to collect taxes, no national court system. We talked about the no executive or judicial branch. So it was just really hard for the Articles of Confederation to actually actually pass through smooth water. It was very rough, as the caption, rough sailing ahead. Let's see. Someone said in the chat, yes, King George III was said to be kind of crazy, as in he was kind of delusional. He did do some questionable things. Next. When was the French and Indian War? I can tell you the direct date from start to finish in the end. Okay, so because of how weak the Articles of Confederation was, we have another kind of rebellion called the Shays Rebellion. Basically, because Congress didn't really have like a regulation of the economy or taxes, or they had a very weak regulation of taxes, or they couldn't levy taxes, many poor farmers were losing their land, and they had no currency to repay their debts. So Shays Rebellion was basically a bunch of farmers, many colonists that felt that, the Articles of Confederation needed to be revised. They demanded lower property taxes, they demanded printing paper money, and they wanted to end the idea of like imprisonment for debt, because imprisonment for debt really followed what the British system was, where like if you had debt, you were to be imprisoned, and many didn't like that. They wanted kind of a brand new, much more efficient form, I guess, of government. So they wanted to revise the Articles of Confederation. So next we were talking about the Constitutional Convention, which happened from May 14th, 1787, September 17th. Basically, this was a reaction to Shays Rebellion, and it was the convention where the Constitution, what we have now, and we still have standing today, was drafted in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. So many don't know the Constitution was actually drafted plenty of times, and it took them actually a long time to have one final, I guess, draft. So the Constitutional Convention established a bicameral Congress, which meant that we had the House of Representatives plus Senate. So what we still have today, and then they also drafted a Bill of Rights, which you still have today, which would list the individual rights that Americans have. And one of the most important things that was wrong about the Articles of Confederation they wanted to fix, and it was the idea that Congress can levy taxes and they can control some form of the national kind of economy. And there was also this first emancipation where Northerners, we added on to it was kind of like an adding on to Northwest Ordinance, where Northerners were eliminating slavery up north, since they had no need for it. And it was also the establishment of the 3/5 Compromise, I think many of you know, where slaves, Africans, and African Americans were actually 3/5. They had 3/5. Well, they were represented as 3/5 of a person through taxation representation, and this benefited a lot of Southerners because they didn't have to tax them that much, and this meant that, you know, they had no representation, or they didn't really have any form of like individual rights. But while it was successful in emancipating some part of, you know, the colonies by eliminating slavery, Congress couldn't interfere with the slave trade until later on. So they couldn't ban the slave trade. They couldn't do anything about the slave trade. And I talked about before, the drafts of the Constitution. Let me just see. Alvin, you have a question? Alvin?
No, I don't really have a question.
Oh, yeah.
I was just gonna make some comments and stuff, but like at the beginning, like you didn't call me, so like I can you like go back to the and stuff?
Yeah, which slide do you want me to go back to?
I don't know, just go back to the slides.
Okay. Tell me when to stop.
I think I was gonna say that like yeah, this one. The town, I had a question on the next slide, but for this side, I was just saying that the Townshend Crisis, the Boston Massacre, it was saying that like the colonists were like protesting again, and they were like a huge crowd throwing rocks and snowballs and stuff at British soldiers. And then even though they were told not to fire, someone was like heard fire and then they fired. Which also I don't think, well, technically they can say it was in self-defense. Just saying that like the firing part was wrong, but to be fair, the colonists were hurling giant rocks and giant snowballs at them, which could do a lot of damage. Okay, can you go to the next slide?
Yep. Oh, let me just go.
In the next slide, like I have a question. Why did they dress as Mohawk Indians?
I think, although the reason not completely sure, they maybe wanted to, you know, kind of like blame or like the Indians for or blame Native Americans for actually throwing the tea in the harbor, rather than like having colonists throw the tea.
How did they know it was the colonists?
I think it's pretty self-explanatory when, like, you know, there was no reason for I guess Native Americans, or there wasn't a strong reason for Native Americans to all of a sudden go into a port in Boston and then get access to the ship and then also throw the tea out. Like, there's many, like, obviously, like, holes in that, I guess, reasoning. Okay. I don't know. We should do more research on it, and you can tell us next class, or you can post it on Google Classroom.
Okay. And also one more thing, Valley Forge wasn't just Washington and that other general or something training troops. Valley Forge was also an important landmark because like it showed how great of a leader George Washington was, and how he like persuaded the troops to fight on even though it was like hella cold and they had like no shoes. And,
and they had like no supplies, and Congress, the Constitutional Congress or Commission Congress, didn't really give them a lot of supplies. So it was a really cold winter.
And one last thing, so like the Britain, it was like after the war, Britain had like very few money, didn't have much money, so they decided to take the money from the American colonists. I have two questions on it. The first question is why didn't the American colonists also help them fight against the didn't America
the French and Indian War?
Didn't the American colonies also fight in that war? So how come they didn't lose any money?
I guess most of the supplies came from British troops, or like money from Britain. Because remember how we talked about how like Britain would also like deploy troops to protect the colonists, right? So I guess like much of the money would probably like, or the funds would probably come from Britain themselves.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing is that like Another thing is, like, the last thing is that, like, why can't, like, Britain just, like, was refusing to learn a lesson. Like, apparently every time they tax something or, like, increase the taxes, the Americans started boycotting. So then Britain lost even more money. So, like, why can't they just, like, not do the taxes if they know that if they do the taxes, there's gonna be rebellion or boycott or something?
Actually, I guess in the beginning of the Stamp Act crisis, many of Parliament in Britain didn't really know that the colonists would act that the way they did. So they, were kind of surprised as well. So I guess none of them really had like the foresight to see like.
Well, why were they surprised? If like you just tell someone like, oh, I want to take some more of your money, and you just like take more money from them.
I guess it's because like because Britain taxed the colony, like before this there was obviously taxation to a certain point, so they thought that increasing it by a little bit wouldn't really do anything. That's probably what they thought.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Albany, you have a question?
Could you go back?
Yeah, which slide? Tell me where to go.
Could you go? This the Boston Tea Party.
Oh, this one.
Well, I don't understand why they had to dress up as Native Americans. It would make more sense if they dressed up as British soldiers.
That is very correct. Do you want to do more research on it with Alvin and maybe post it on Google Classroom and to see like why they dressed up as Mohawk Indians? I think that's really good. I guess, can I answer questions? I'm going to answer the rest of the questions later. I'm just going to finish the slides first, and then we're going to spend some time for questions. So we talked a lot about, we didn't really talk a lot about like women after, the American Revolution. So the role of women after the American Revolution followed this strict code of what is called Republican motherhood. Again, we see the idea of a Republican stemming from republicanism. So we know the idea of, elected officials, free to be governed, idea to be, in this role of women as well. So many, obviously, like before, they had no legal identity, they had no legal rights over their children or their property. Republican motherhood emphasized the idea that women were really moral and they were really good for raising their children. And they had to raise their children. They had to be at home to raise their children because the children needed, a moral figure so they could be good, upright citizens that would join later to be part of the political sphere or take active part in the government or certain jobs. So because of this, some actually wanted a certain, like there was actually some form of expansion for education because many people thought that, many leaders thought that, women had to have the correct education in order to instruct their sons to be good political leaders and instruct their daughters to do this, to be really good mothers when they grow up. So that was mainly like this idea of like Republican motherhood after the American Revolution. We see this picture ahead. We see this picture here. There's many had a lot of kids, and then the father's obviously standing, maybe showing a higher position than the woman sitting down. There's a lot of ways you can analyze this picture. Next. So after after the American Revolution happened, the Constitutional Convention, we have some form of government. We have an idea of what some form of government from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, from electing, Washington as president. So we have this, I guess, conflict between the Anti-Federalists versus the Federalists. So, today we have two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, or like two main political parties, the Democrats and Republicans. While the Anti-Federalists versus Federalists weren't considered the first political party, we're actually going to be, they were actually pretty close, almost like predecessor to what like the two different groups that dominated the political sphere. So as we can read here, the Federalists favored a ratification of the Constitution. They wanted a powerful federal government. They argued that a Bill of Rights was not needed, and because federal power as of itself in the Constitution, was already limited. And there's something the many Federalists wrote what was called the Federalist Papers. So the three authors of Federalist Papers were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, basically writing that the Constitution was good and we need to ratify it. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, it consisted of Thomas Jefferson and other leaders as well. So Thomas Jefferson was like a really key leader from the Anti-Federalists. They opposed the ratification of the Constitution, and they wanted a weak federal government that would not threaten state rights. They wanted a Bill of Rights because they wanted to declare the rights of people, the rights that the government couldn't take away. And the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, they all debated over the ratification of the Constitution and whether or not the government that that was created during the Constitutional Convention was good for the people, and whether or not it was actually beneficial for the Americans or the colonists. And again, we see here, the Bill of Rights, and this is what they kind of almost had in common, but what happened, okay, and what the ratifications. I'm gonna go next. Oops. Okay, so we would talk about this maybe more during class, since we're running out of time, since there were a lot of questions, but the start of the Federalist Era. So the start of Federalist Era comes from around 1789 to 1800. First elected was George Washington, and then we had Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton played an important part as treasurer, and he basically proposed a national bank, a tax on liquor, and assuming state debt and turning into federal debt. So each state had debt because we talked about one, like the farmers collecting debt, and also debt from the actual revolution itself. Hamilton said, we'll take that debt and the federal government will pay for it. We'll find a way to pay for it. And obviously, his proposals and ideas were very controversial, and that furthered the divide between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and more debates over the Constitution, over whether or not a national bank was good, and over whether or not Congress actually had these powers that Hamilton proposed. So we see these two arguments, two people, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, others, arguments against Hamilton's proposal of a national bank and assuming state debt. So you can read this. I will also be able to post the slides after class as well. So we see Thomas Jefferson, he thought that a national bank would hurt smaller banks. He felt that it was unconstitutional because it gave the federal government too much power. James Madison, he said that a 20-year charter, which was what Hamilton proposed, was too long, and it was too crazy for especially a new country, since he thought that new systems would be implemented and then more improvements. Next. So I do this daily. For those of you who are new to class, I do this kind of daily, I would say meme or two memes or like two pictures that are pretty relevant to what we learned today. And they're using terms that I guess that are more modern that people understand. So, and I think they're pretty funny as well, given the context. And fun fact, the foot or the feet as measurement was actually supposedly taken as measurement of King Henry from Britain. It's a feet. So not King George III, but way before that, King Henry. And I was about to share a video, run a video of Hamilton, which is a musical written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, which I think is very good if you want to learn more about the history of the history of the founding era, or the founding era itself. I thought to play a song that it was sung in the perspective of King George III, the person many deemed crazy, and the king that was against, obviously, the other opposing side of the American Revolution. But I will don't think we have time for that, since I'll just be answering questions. I'll post this on Google Classroom later alongside the slides and probably also the YouTube link. Other than that, does anyone have any questions? You can ask, you can ask in the chat, or you can raise your hands. Alvin, assuming state debt attorney basically if one state owes something, they have a yes, yeah, Alvin, yeah. The argument there was, yeah, if one state owns something, that means that the whole country owns that debt, and that means the federal government had to pay that debt either due to taxes or something else. So many people thought it was really, really unfair, especially the Anti-Federalists thought that was really unfair because, you know, obviously some states were in debt. We talked about how certain farmers certain farmers that like relied on agriculture, they had more debt than others, and obviously that state has more debt. So that means that New York, many of the northern colonies, or northern states, I guess, had to pay for that. So yeah, it was kind of unfair. Can you explain the Shays Rebellion thing more? The Shays kill rich people. Yeah, for sure. So there was a lot of I can post another video on that if you want more about Shays Rebellion. But yeah, for Shays Rebellion, there was actually some violence against many rich people because they felt that, you know, they had a lot of money. There was actually a lot of violence against rich, wealthy landowners because many of the impoverished or the poor farmers were actually working for the wealthy landowners. Probably the wealthy landowners they were probably giving them rent or, you know, some sort of payment. So there was some violence against rich people or the wealthy landowners. What should this video? Do we have to do this? Is this optional? Yes. So looking forward to the next class. I posted a Google form which will be like some questions on it's like kind of homework, some questions on, you know, what we learned today. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. And yes, I think if you're asking that, that is that is not optional. For those of you who don't have any more questions, you can leave. And I'll see you in next class. For those of you who do, you can always email me, or you can stay for like the 2 minutes we have now.
Excuse me?
Yes, I don't know who's talking.
Oh, the one who's raising.
Oh, Sophie? Yes, you have a question?
Like the meme. Can you like go back to the meme page?
Which one? The union?
The meme page.
Oh, the meme. Oh, okay. So
Why did you say
yeah.
we Americans reject your royalties, laws, blah 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 blah, but we will never reject King Henry's foot as a unit of
Yeah. So it's kind of this like funny, I guess, thing where like, you know, Americans rejected they didn't want the tea, they didn't like the taxes, they didn't like the laws, right? And didn't like, you know, certain spellings of words, but they never really rejected King Henry's foot, which is what we use now as like a measurement, you know, like 1 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet. So it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of like, oh, like how ironic, or like that's very contradictory of America. It's just like that's like funny kind of thing. I don't think you should think too much in it. It's just supposed to be kind of like this funny, like, oh, like fun fact.
Okay.
So someone asked does anyone have any other questions?
Also, can you post like a meme video?
Yes, I will post the Hamilton video, and I will do what I did last class. I'll post like links where you can learn more about Shay's Rebellion, or some people wanted to learn more about the Boston Tea Party. I'll do that. And I'll also post the dates of in French and Indian War, the exact dates, because it was kind of spread out. Okay. If people don't have any questions, we're actually going to end this class now.
Thank you.
So,